This happened when I was 26, in my second year with the department. I'm not going to say exactly which reservation, because it's small enough that people would know who I am. And honestly, I still work there. And I don't need the calls I'd get if this got back around. I'll just say it's a rural one. A lot of land, not a lot of people. And most of it is the kind of dark you only get when there's no highway lighting for 40 miles in either direction. I was still riding solo by then, which for a department our size didn't mean much. Solo just meant the next unit was 25 minutes out if you called for backup. Not that you were unsupervised. My sergeant was a guy named Ray Curtis. Older guy, been on the job since before I was born, and he was the one who trained me on the graveyard shift. Ray used to say the reservation had two kinds of nights. The nights where nothing happens because everyone's asleep, and the nights where nothing happens because everyone's pretending to be. I didn't know what he meant by that for a long time. My beat covered a stretch of 2-lane that ran along the river bottom, past the old mission, out to where the allotments thinned into just scrub and fence line. There was a turnout at about mile 12, just a gravel pull-off where the county used to stage equipment, wide enough for 2 trucks. Nothing else out there. I probably drove past that turnout 4 or 5 times a shift for a year and never thought twice about it. I want to back up and say a little about what the job actually looked like out there, because I think it matters for understanding how something like this can go unremarked for as long as it did. Tribal police departments, especially small ones, run differently than what people picture when they think of a patrol car and a beat. A lot of the calls are domestic, a lot are livestock, a lot are just checking on elders who live too far out for anyone in their family to get to easily. You spend a huge amount of your shift completely alone, further from backup than most municipal officers ever are. And you develop a relationship with your own patrol route that's less like a job and more like knowing a person. You know its moods, you know what's normal for it at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday versus what's normal for it on a powwow weekend when there's more traffic than usual. Mile 12, for the first year I worked it, was just one more mile marker. Nothing about it stood out from mile 11 or mile 13. That's part of what made the car so easy to dismiss at first. I wasn't primed to notice it as strange. It just slotted into the routine the way anything does when you see it enough times. Then, one night in October, I started seeing a car parked there. Just parked, no plates I could ever quite catch in my spotlight. I want to be honest, I never actually got a clean look at the plate. And I've turned that over 100 times. Whether I was being careless, or whether there was something about the angle that just never let me. Older sedan, dark color. Hard to tell exactly what color at night. No one in it, as far as I could tell from the road. I'd noted in my log, vehicle unoccupied. Mile 12 turnout. And keep going. Wasn't my job to run every car parked somewhere at 2 a.m. People slept off benders out there. People met up out there. Not my business unless it looked like a problem. It started showing up more than once a week. Then it was most nights. Always the turnout. Always empty as far as I could see. I asked Ray about it once. Half joking. Said somebody's got a favorite makeout spot at mile 12. He didn't laugh. He just said, "Don't run that plate," and changed the subject, and at the time I figured he just meant it wasn't worth the paperwork. There was a stretch of a couple weeks, maybe 5 weeks in, where I started noticing something about the tree line behind the turnout, on the nights the car was there. I don't mean I saw anything specific in the trees. I mean that the trees themselves seemed to sit differently. I know that sounds like nothing, and for a long time I told myself it was nothing, just headlight angles playing tricks, shadows falling wrong because I was approaching from a slightly different point on the road, depending on my speed. But there were nights. The branches looked like they were holding still, in a way that didn't match the wind I could feel through my own window. Like the air moving across the road wasn't the same air moving back there. I never mentioned this to anyone. It's the kind of thing that sounds like nothing when you say it out loud, and it felt like even less at 2 a.m. when all I wanted was to finish my loop and get back to the station. The first thing that actually snagged in my head and I want to be clear, at the time it barely registered as anything, was that I never once saw that car in the daytime. I worked graveyard, so I didn't have a ton of daylight overlap with that stretch, but I'd occasionally swing back through around dawn on my way to end of shift, and the turnout was always empty by then. I just figured whoever it was left before I looped back. That's the kind of thing you explain away in about half a second when you're 26 and tired and thinking about breakfast. Where it started to actually bother me was maybe 6 weeks in. I pulled up on the turnout the way I always did, slowed down, ran my spotlight over it out of habit, and the car was there. Same as always, but this time there was someone standing next to it. Just standing. Not doing anything, not looking at their phone, not looking at me. Facing the tree line on the far side. Back to the road. I did what you're trained to do. I called it in, gave my location, said I had a subject at the mile 12 turnout, requested a backup unit even though I knew it'd take a while. Dispatch that night was a woman named Denise, been there forever, and she read it back to me normal, no hesitation. I got out of my truck. I said the thing you say, evening, everything all right out here. And the person didn't turn around. Didn't move at all, actually, that I could see. I remember thinking, before anything else, that it was cold enough that I could see my breath, and I couldn't see theirs. But I told myself that was just the angle, that I wasn't looking at the right spot to catch it. I took maybe 4 or 5 steps closer, and I said it again, a little firmer this time. Identified myself, tribal police, asked them to turn around and show me their hands. And they did turn. Slow, not sudden. Nothing jump scare about it. I want to say that clearly. Because it wasn't like the movies. They just turned like a person turns. I'm not going to describe the face. I've thought about how to describe it more times than I can count, and I've never landed on anything that doesn't sound like I'm exaggerating for effect, or like I'm making something up because a blank description feels unsatisfying. I'll just say it was wrong in a way I couldn't isolate, like a word you can't remember, right on the edge of your mouth. I didn't feel like I was looking at a stranger's face. I felt like I was looking at a face I should have recognized and couldn't. I didn't draw my weapon. I want to be honest about that, because people ask, and the honest answer is that my hand never moved toward it. Not because I decided not to. It just didn't occur to me, in that moment, as an available option, which still doesn't sit right with me, given the training. I also remember, in whatever span of time I actually stood there, that the ordinary sounds of that stretch of road just weren't happening. No river sound, even though the water was close enough that I could usually hear it from the turnout on a still night. No insects, though it was still warm enough that time of year for them. Not even my own truck, engine still running, door still open, headlights still on. I couldn't hear any of it, the way you can't hear your own heartbeat unless you go looking for it. Except this was every sound at once, gone the same way. I've asked myself many times since whether that's a real memory or something my mind built afterward to make sense of the gap. And I honestly don't know the answer. The next thing I have any clear memory of is being back in my truck with the door shut, and the turnout was empty. No car, no person. My dash clock said 11 minutes had passed since I'd called it in to Denise. I do not have 11 minutes. I have maybe 90 seconds, tops, and then I'm in the truck. Denise's log, I checked it later more than once, shows the call coming in, shows me confirming I was out of the vehicle, and shows me calling back in. Subject gone. All clear. 11 minutes later, in my own voice, using the correct codes, sounding her words, completely normal. I don't remember making that second call. I didn't tell Ray everything that first time. I told him a version, car, guy standing there, guy took off before I could get a good look, probably just spooked and ran off through the trees. Ray listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which for him was unusual. And when I finished, he just nodded slow and said, "Mile 12, not a question," like he already knew the location before I said it. Which, in fairness, maybe he did, since I'd been logging that same turnout for 6 weeks by then. I kept driving that beat. Obviously, wasn't like I could request a new route without a better reason than the one I actually had. The car came back, not every night anymore, but maybe twice a month, always the same turnout, and I want to say I got better at just not stopping. I'd log it, unoccupied vehicle, and keep going. And I told myself that was fine, that was following procedure, since technically an unoccupied parked car isn't a call for a welfare check. Except I know it wasn't always unoccupied. I know because there were nights I'd drive past at speed, not even slow down, and in my mirror, just for a second, just in the taillight glow, I'd see it wasn't empty anymore. I never stopped for those. I'm not proud of that exactly, but I also don't think I'm going to apologize for it. In between that first encounter and the night I finally told Ray everything, there were a couple other things that happened that I didn't mention to anybody for a long time. Partly because on their own they didn't sound like much, and I didn't want to be the rookie who couldn't handle a quiet beat. The first was small. My truck's odometer and my patrol log stopped agreeing with each other on nights I'd passed the turnout. Not by a lot, a mile and a half some nights more, but consistently in the same direction, like I'd driven further than the log accounted for, or the log had lost time somewhere. I chalked it up to a bad habit of not logging mileage precisely at every checkpoint, which, in fairness, wasn't out of the question for a rookie still getting his routine down. I only really noticed the pattern because I started, without really deciding to, checking the odometer every single time I passed mile 12, like some part of me wanted proof of something before I had a name for what. The second thing was that Denise, our dispatcher, mentioned once, offhand, that she'd started getting a strange kind of quiet on the radio whenever I keyed up near that stretch. Not dead air exactly, she said. More like the channel sounded like it was underwater for a second or two before it cleared. She said it like a joke. Said maybe the repeater had a weak spot out there, and I laughed along with her because that was the easy thing to do. But I noticed, after that I started keying up earlier than I needed to when I was coming up on the turnout. Like I wanted my voice already established on the channel before I got close, in case the quiet thing happened and I needed dispatch to already know I was talking. None of that is dramatic. I'm including it because it's the kind of thing that on its own means nothing. And it was only looking back, after everything else, that I started stacking those small oddities up against each other and wondering if they'd been trying to tell me something the whole time, in a language I wasn't fluent enough yet to read. I finally told Ray the whole thing, the real version, about 4 months in, after a night where the car was parked further into the turnout than usual, close enough to the tree line that half of it should have been in the brush, and it wasn't. Like the brush had just made room. Ray took me to get coffee after shift, which he never did, and he told me that turnout has had cars reported at it, off and on, going back as long as he'd worked the department, which was going on 30 years. Different cars, different decades. By different officers' accounts. Old models in the 70s reports, newer models more recently, always matching whatever a car from that particular decade might reasonably look like, which is its own kind of detail I still think about. He said the department's unofficial policy, going back further than him, was log it and move on. Nobody investigates the turnout. Nobody runs the plate. He wouldn't tell me what happened to the ones who did. Only that there'd been at least one, a long time before his time. And he said it in a way that made it clear he didn't actually know the details either, just that it was passed down as a reason not to ask. I'm 34 now. I still work that beat. Most weeks. The car still shows up, maybe once a month now. Sometimes less. I've got 2 rookies of my own I've trained since, and there's a mile 12 turnout conversation I have with each of them. Sooner or later, that goes about the way mine did with Ray. I don't have an explanation for any of it. I checked the county records once, years back. Tried to find out if that turnout had ever been the site of anything. Accident. Before my time, anything. And there's nothing on file. At least, nothing I could find. Which either means nothing ever happened there, or it means whatever did happen isn't the kind of thing that makes it into county records. One of my rookies, a few years back, didn't take the mile 12 conversation the way I had, where I'd mostly just filed it away and kept driving. She pushed on it, asked me straight out if I'd ever tried setting up a trail camera at the turnout, off the books, just to see. I told her no, and when she asked why not, I didn't have a great answer beyond a feeling that some things you're better off not documenting. A feeling I inherited from Ray, without ever really examining it. She wasn't satisfied with that, and about 2 months later she told me she'd gone ahead and done it herself, on a night off. Mounted a game camera in the brush across from the turnout, came back for it. 2 days later, she showed me the memory card without much of a lead-up. There were maybe 40 photos on it, triggered by motion over those 2 days, and 30 some of them were nothing. A raccoon, a truck passing on the road, wind moving a branch. The last several, though, were all time-stamped the same night, close together, and every one of them was just the turnout. Empty. Gravel. Nothing in frame at all, except the timestamps ran backward. Not sequentially forward like a normal series of motion triggers would, but counting down, each photo a few minutes earlier than the one before it, ending at a timestamp about 10 minutes before the camera itself was even physically mounted, according to what she remembered of when she'd set it up. She didn't go back out to the turnout after that, not off-duty anyway, and she didn't bring it up with me again unless I asked. I didn't ask often. Ray retired about 6 years ago now, moved off the reservation to live near his daughter, and before he left, he handed off a few things to me the way senior guys do. Some paperwork nobody else wanted. A spare set of tire chains, that kind of thing. One of the things he gave me was a small spiral notebook, older than the department's current logging system, that he said had been passed to him by the sergeant before him. I only looked through it once, and most of it is just mileage notes and shift handoffs. Nothing remarkable, except for a handful of entries scattered across probably 20 years that just say, in different handwriting each time, mile 12, unoccupied, or some close variation, with no further comment. I recognized my own handwriting in 3 of those entries, and did not remember writing 2 of them. I don't take that notebook out much. I know exactly where it is, in the bottom drawer of my desk at the station, and some part of me feels like keeping track of it is its own kind of duty. Though I couldn't tell you to who, I still don't stop for it. I don't think I'm going to start. I was tribal police for almost 11 years, before I transferred over to a bigger department off the reservation, and this story is from the last winter I worked there. So I'd have been about 31, 32. I'm telling it because my old partner from that department passed a couple years back. And I think about this call more, now that there's nobody left who is actually there with me to tell it straight, if that makes sense. Like it's on me now to get it right, or nobody will. We got a welfare check request in late January, during a stretch of weather that had already shut half the county roads for 3 days. The call came from a woman 2 counties over, saying she hadn't heard from her mother in almost a week, which normally wouldn't trigger anything urgent. Cell service out on Route 4 was spotty even in good weather, and elders went quiet for stretches all the time without it meaning anything. But this woman said her mother always called on Sundays, no exceptions, going back years. And it was now Thursday. My partner that shift was a guy named Delbert Yazzie. I'm using his name because his family already knows this story, and he told it plenty of times himself before he passed, so I don't feel like I'm speaking out of turn. Delbert had grown up not far from that stretch of Route 4 and knew the family a little. Knew the mother, an older woman living alone since her husband died. Name was Irene, kept mostly to herself, raised sheep. We took the truck out because the road wasn't going to be passable in a sedan. Snow drifted up over the fence line in places. No other vehicles out at all that morning, which Delbert made a point of mentioning more than once. Nobody's driving today. Nobody's going to be driving today. I didn't think much of it as a comment at the time. In hindsight, I think he was already uneasy and talking to fill the quiet. Delbert was the kind of officer who'd been everywhere on the reservation twice over. Knew half the families by name. Knew which dogs to expect at which houses. Knew who'd had a hard winter and who hadn't. And normally that made him easy to work with, because he could read a situation before you'd even parked. That morning, he wasn't reading anything out loud. He kept the radio on louder than usual, which I noticed, because Delbert usually liked it quiet. Said too much chatter made it harder to hear what mattered. The drive out to Irene's took the better part of 40 minutes, on roads that should have taken 15 in normal weather, snow packed hard in the ruts. Drifts high enough in places that Delbert had to get out twice and check the depth by eye before we pushed the truck through. The land out that way is about as isolated as the reservation gets. Irene's place was the last house before the road turned to a Forest Service track that didn't get plowed at all. Meaning if something had gone wrong out there wasn't another house within 4 miles in any direction that could have heard it happen. Irene's place was a single-story house set back off the road maybe a quarter-mile down a rutted drive, sheep pen off to one side. Looked empty of animals when we pulled up, which Delbert also flagged, said she kept 8-9 head normally, and he didn't see any. And in that cold, they'd usually be huddled near the barn, not out of sight entirely. Smoke was coming from the chimney. That's the detail I keep coming back to, because it meant somebody had fed that stove sometime in the last few hours. Stoves don't run themselves for a week straight on their own, and that should have been a relief. Evidence somebody's home, somebody's alive in there. Except, it didn't feel like a relief. Neither of us said why. We just both slowed down walking up to the porch. Delbert knocked and called her by name, said who we were, and there wasn't an answer. But there also wasn't the kind of silence you get from an empty house. I don't know how else to put it. You develop an ear for occupied versus unoccupied doing this job long enough, and that house did not read as empty to either of us. Delbert tried the door, unlocked, which he said was normal for her, and we went in announcing ourselves the whole way. The front room was warm, stove going, and tidy. Nothing out of place, a cup of tea sitting on the side table that still had a thin curl of steam coming off it. I want to be precise about the steam because it's the thing that stuck with me hardest. Not cold, not gone cold, still steaming. Meaning somebody had poured it recently enough that it hadn't had time to cool, in a house we'd just determined nobody was answering the door of. We went room to room. Bedroom made, bed made tight, no sign anybody had slept rough or been sick or fallen. Bathroom, kitchen, nothing. No Irene. Back door was locked from the inside, which we checked because it was the kind of detail that mattered. If she'd walked out to check on the sheep, she'd have gone out the back, and the back was locked from the inside. With the kind of latch you can't set walking away from it. You have to be standing right there to throw it. The bedroom had one thing that stuck with me, which was that the curtains were drawn tight, pinned at the edges with clothespins, so no gap of daylight could get through, which Delbert said wasn't normal for her. Irene liked her curtains open, liked to see the sheep pen from her window first thing, and he said he'd never known her to pin them shut like that. There was a chair pulled up close to the window anyway, angled like someone had been sitting there facing the gap where the pin held the fabric together, close enough to have watched through that narrow sliver if they'd wanted to, without being able to see out any further than that. We checked the closets too, standard procedure, and everything was in order. Coats hung, boots paired, nothing missing that either of us could tell, which is part of why the coatless walk into a whiteout later made so little sense. Every coat she owned, as far as we could determine afterward with her daughter's help, was accounted for in that closet. Delbert went out to check the barn and the pen while I stayed at the house per protocol, and I remember standing in that front room by myself with that tea still steaming and feeling, I don't have a better word for it than watched, and I know how that sounds coming from a police officer trained to not put stock in feelings on a call. But I'm telling you what I felt, not what I could put in a report. I did not put it in the report. While I waited, I did a slower pass of the front room. The kind you do less because protocol requires it, and more because standing still in that quiet felt worse than moving. There was a wall of photographs near the stove. Irene with her husband, some grandkids I recognized from the reservation school, an old black and white of people I didn't know. One of the frames was tipped forward slightly. Not fallen, just leaned, like somebody had picked it up and set it back not quite square. I only noticed because everything else in that house was so precisely kept. I picked it up to straighten it and saw it was a photo of Irene herself, younger, standing in front of that same house with 4 or 5 other people I didn't recognize. And for just a second, and I want to stress this could easily have been my own nerves doing something to my eyes in bad light, I did not think Irene was looking at the camera in that photograph. I thought she was looking just past it, at whoever was standing where I was standing. I set the frame down and didn't touch anything else in that room. There was also a second cup on the counter by the sink, already washed and set in the drying rack, dry enough that it had clearly been done a while ago, sitting next to the one on the side table that was still warm. Irene lived alone. I didn't mention the second cup to Delbert at the time. I don't fully know why. I think I didn't want it to be a real detail yet. Delbert came back maybe 10 minutes later and he was different. Quieter, moving faster than the cold really called for. He said the sheep were all in the barn. All 9 head. Fine. Fed. Watered. Like somebody had done chores that morning. He said there were footprints all through the snow around the pen and the barn. Fresh ones. Boot prints. Consistent size going back and forth like normal daily chores. And then he said there weren't any prints leading up to the house. Not from the barn, not from the road. Nowhere. The chore prints existed in a closed loop around the outbuildings and never once connected to the house. 40 feet away, in snow, undisturbed, everywhere else. We called it in as it was. Resident not located. Structure secure. Evidence of recent occupancy. No visible means of egress explaining the resident's absence. Search and rescue got mobilized that afternoon once the roads cleared enough, and they worked that property and the surrounding land for 2 days. I wasn't on the search team myself. That wasn't my role once it escalated past the welfare check. But Delbert stayed close to it because he knew the land and the family, and he told me afterward that the search dogs behaved strangely almost from the start. 2 separate handlers reported their dogs picking up a scent trail leaving from the barn. Not the house, the barn, and following it out in a straight line for close to 3 miles before both dogs, independently, on different days, stopped at almost the exact same spot and would not continue. Not spooked exactly, Delbert said. More like they'd simply decided the job was done, sitting down in the snow and refusing to move forward no matter what their handlers tried. That was roughly where Irene was eventually found, another mile or so beyond where the dogs had stopped. Discovered instead by a search volunteer working the grid on foot, who said he'd only found her because he heard something and it turned out to be her, faint and hoarse. Though, when they asked her later, she had no memory of making any sound at all, no memory of calling out. Nothing. They found Irene on the second day, alive, about 4 miles from the house, in a stretch of land with no shelter and nothing to explain how she survived. 2 nights in that cold with no coat, which she wasn't wearing when they found her. She was in bad shape, hypothermic, disoriented, and she was in the hospital a long while after. But she pulled through. I never got to interview her myself. That fell to a different officer once the medical situation stabilized, and by all accounts, when they finally asked her, she said she didn't remember leaving the house. Said the last clear thing she remembered was making tea on what she thought was a Tuesday. She had no memory of the days in between, no memory of feeding the sheep, no memory of walking 4 miles in January with no coat, nothing. Delbert and I talked about it exactly once more after that. A few weeks later, off duty, and neither one of us had anything to add to what we'd both seen. The tea, the locked back door, the prints that circled the outbuildings and never touched the house. He said something I've never been able to shake, which was that in his experience growing up out there, the old folks used to say, "You don't ask who's been minding the animals, if you weren't the one who left food out. I didn't know what to do with that then, and I still don't. I never asked him to explain it further, and now I can't. Irene lived another 6 years after that. I saw her a handful of times at community events before she passed, and she was sharp, funny, entirely herself. I never brought it up with her directly. I figured if she wanted to talk about it, she would have, and she never did. There's one more thing I've never told anyone outside of Delbert, and I'm only including it now because he's gone and I don't feel like it's protecting anything to keep sitting on it. About a year after Irene was found, I had reason to drive back out that same stretch of Route 4 on an unrelated call. Different house entirely, and on my way past Irene's old property. She'd moved into town by then to stay closer to her daughter, and the house had been sitting empty. I slowed down out of habit more than anything. There was smoke coming from the chimney. Thin, but there. I didn't stop. I told myself it was probably kids, or a relative airing the place out, or a dozen other explanations that all made more sense than the one I actually thought of first. I never mentioned it to the family. I never drove that road again unless a call required it, and when it did, I didn't slow down.